I didn't file a full report. I want to say that up front, before anything else, because it matters. I'm a park ranger. I believe in documentation. I believe in chain of command and incident logs, and the kind of institutional transparency that keeps people safe in places where safe is never guaranteed. I believe in all of that. And I still didn't file a full report. I kept what happened at Chimney Hollow to myself for 11 months. Not because I was protecting the Park Service, not because I was afraid of how it would look on my record. I kept it to myself because I spent 4 of those 11 months trying to convince myself that a rational explanation existed, and the remaining 7 accepting that it didn't. Neither phase left me with anything I could put in an official document. I'm telling it now because a new ranger has been assigned to Chimney Hollow Outpost for the autumn rotation. Her name is in the interdepartment directory. Her emergency contact information is listed beside it. I read her file twice. She has no idea what that outpost is. She has no idea what the supplemental protocols mean, or why they were written, or what happens when you don't take them seriously on day 3. She leaves for the posting in 9 days. This is everything I know. This is everything I should have said 11 months ago and didn't. I hope it reaches someone who can use it. It starts the way most bad decisions do, with a job posting that looked like an opportunity. I applied for the Chimney Hollow assignment in late August. The posting listed it as a 6-week solo backcountry rotation, autumn season, wildlife population monitoring, trail clearance after windfall events, visitor quota enforcement at the eastern trailheads. Standard seasonal work. The kind of posting that looks unremarkable on paper, but carries real weight in a career like mine, because attached to it was something I'd been working toward for 2 years. A field certification for remote solo operations in high elevation backcountry terrain. That certification meant a promotion tier. It meant moving from administrative support roles into full field assignment eligibility. It meant, in the plainest terms I can offer, that I had spent 6 years studying wildlife management and 2 years filing reports from a district office 40 miles from the nearest trailhead. And this posting was the thing that would finally put me where I believed I belonged. I was 31 years old. I had a graduate degree, a clean service record, and what I can now recognize as a near total absence of appropriate humility. I submitted my application the same afternoon I found the listing. I received confirmation of assignment 11 days later. I told myself it was because I was qualified. It probably was. I have since wondered, in the long and sleepless way that I wonder about most things now, whether qualification was the only reason I was selected. Whether someone, somewhere in the department, understood exactly what Chimney Hollow was, and made a calculation about who to send there. I don't have evidence for that. I want to be clear about that. I have a tendency now, 11 months out, to find patterns in things that may simply be coincidence. That tendency is one of the things Chimney Hollow left me with. The posting packet arrived by email. I printed it. I read it 3 times. I made notes in the margins about the wildlife survey grids, the radio check-in schedule, the fire road gate protocol. I did not read anything unusual in those pages. The unusual part wasn't in the posting packet. It was bolted to the wall of the outpost. But I didn't know that yet. I drove the fire road on a Tuesday morning in early October. 7 miles of unpaved gravel and packed clay, single lane, cut through the interior of the park's backcountry management zone. The road wasn't maintained for comfort. It was maintained for access. And barely that. My truck found every rut and washout from the summer's rain season. And by mile 3, I was averaging about 8 miles an hour and paying more attention to the road surface than to anything else. Then I started paying attention to the forest. The Smokies in October are something that photographs don't fully prepare you for. The canopy was at peak color. Red maple and yellow birch and the deep amber of the tulip poplars layered up the ridgeline in a way that looked less like a natural occurrence and more like something deliberate. Morning fog sat in the hollows below the road, white and still, and the smell coming through my cracked window was wet hemlock and cold creek water, and something faintly sweet from the leaf decay on the forest floor. It was genuinely beautiful. I want to say that clearly. Whatever Chimney Hollow became for me, the forest itself was beautiful, and that beauty was real. But somewhere around mile 4, I noticed the quiet. Not the ordinary quiet of a forest in the morning, which is never actually quiet. Birds, insects, wind through branches, the drip of last night's rain from the canopy. That kind of quiet has texture to it. This was different. After mile marker 4, the birdsong stopped. Not gradually. It was present, and then it wasn't. Like crossing a threshold I couldn't see. No movement at the road's edge. No deer. No grouse lifting from the undergrowth. The forest looked fully alive and sounded completely empty. I told myself it was the truck engine. Vehicles suppress wildlife activity. I knew that. It was a reasonable explanation. I held on to it for about 3 miles. Then I reached the outpost, and I stopped thinking about the quiet, because I had other things to think about. The outgoing ranger was waiting outside when I pulled up. Sergeant Yolanda Pruitt. 15 years with the Park Service, the last 2 of which had included at least 1 rotation at Chimney Hollow. I'd looked her up in the department directory before driving out. She was compact and precise-looking, the kind of ranger who carried herself like the job was a physical discipline rather than a career. Her gear was already loaded in the bed of her truck. Her truck was already pointed down the fire road. She handed me the outpost keys before I'd fully gotten out of my vehicle. "Mercer," she said. Not a question. She'd been told my name. Sergeant Pruitt. I took the keys. "I wasn't expecting you to be ready to." Checklist is inside on the equipment table. She was already moving toward her driver's door. Generator fuel is topped. Radio battery backup is charged. Water filtration needs a new cartridge by week 3. I appreciate the read the rule book before dark. She said it the way you'd say, check the weather forecast, or don't leave the gate unlocked. Flat. Informational. Like it was the most practical piece of advice she could offer. And she didn't have time to make it sound like anything more than that. I almost asked her which rule book. I almost asked what she meant by before dark specifically. What the significance of the timing was. Whether she was referring to the standard operational protocols or something else. I didn't ask, because she was in her truck by then, and the engine was running, and she pulled out of the outpost clearing and onto the fire road without looking back. No wave, no good luck, nothing. I stood in the clearing, holding the outpost keys and watching her truck disappear around the first bend. And I felt something I chose, at the time, to interpret as professional dismissiveness on her part, rather than what it actually was. She was afraid. She had been afraid for however long she'd been at Chimney Hollow. And she was leaving. And she was not going to spend one additional minute in that clearing if she could help it. I understand that now. I didn't understand it then. The outpost was a single-story structure, wood-framed, dark green paint, metal roof, functional and unlovely in the way that all backcountry ranger infrastructure tends to be built for endurance rather than comfort, with every design decision driven by maintenance, simplicity, and weather resistance. Inside, a main room with a work desk, equipment wall, and the radio station, a small kitchen, a bathroom, sleeping quarters with a cot, a wardrobe, and a window that faced the tree line. At the back of the main room, a door leading to the observation deck, elevated platform, wooden railing, clear sight line to the eastern ridgeline across the hollow. I walked through all of it in about 4 minutes. I checked the radio, the generator, the water filtration unit. Everything was as Pruitt had said. Functional, stocked, maintained. The outpost had the feeling of a place that had been used for a long time by people who were careful about leaving it ready for the next person. In the kitchen, on the counter beside the small propane stove, there was a steel thermos. I picked it up. It was warm. Not room temperature warm, genuinely warm, the way a thermos is warm when the coffee inside it was made within the last hour. Pruitt had left less than 40 minutes before I arrived. She'd been here less than an hour before I pulled up. I stood in the kitchen, holding the warm thermos and doing the math on her departure time. And I arrived at a small, nagging wrongness that I couldn't quite name. She hadn't lingered. She hadn't made coffee and sat with it. She'd made coffee and left before she'd finished it. And she'd left fast enough that the thermos was still warm when I got there. I set it back on the counter. I went to find the rulebook. It was on the equipment wall, between the fire weather chart and the emergency frequency list. Not a binder, not a folder tucked into a desk drawer. A laminated sheet, letter-sized, mounted at eye level on 2 metal bolts driven directly into the wall. The kind of mounting you use when you want something to stay exactly where you put it and never be moved or lost or accidentally filed somewhere it won't be seen. The header read, in plain department standard font, Chimney Hollow Station, Supplemental Operational Protocols, Seasonal Personnel, Mandatory Review, upon arrival. Below the header, 12 numbered rules. The first 5 were standard: fire weather thresholds and radio protocol, gate lock times, wildlife encounter reporting, emergency extraction request procedure, the kind of operational baseline that exists at every remote posting in the park system, worded in the flat. Functional language that Park Service documentation always uses. Rules 6 through 12 were different. I noticed it immediately, not in a dramatic way, not the way that horror stories usually frame the moment when someone reads something they shouldn't. It was more like the subtle wrongness of a sentence that's grammatically correct, but somehow means something other than what it appears to mean. The language was still official, still formatted correctly, but the content had shifted into territory that standard operational protocols don't occupy. I read all 12 rules once, standing in front of the wall with my jacket still on and my truck keys still in my hand. When I finished, I went back to rules 6 through 12 and read them again. The second read was slower. By the third read, I had taken my phone out of my jacket pocket and photographed the entire sheet. I wasn't sure why. Professional reflex, maybe? Or something quieter than that, the instinct to document a thing before you decide what to do about it. Rule 7 read as follows. Do not whistle in any form, melodic or rhythmic, within the tree line or after 1900 hours. This includes humming that carries a consistent pitch. If you hear a whistle that is not your own, do not respond to it. Do not repeat it. Log it in Section 7 of your duty report and maintain your current position. I read it 3 times. Then I almost laughed. I want to be honest about that. My first genuine reaction to Rule 7 was the kind of skeptical half-laugh that comes out of you when you're confronted with something so far outside your professional frame of reference that your brain treats it as a joke before it can treat it as anything else. No whistling after 7 in the evening. And if something whistled back at you, don't respond. My second thought was hazing. New seasonal ranger, remote posting, strange rule added to the official sheet by some veteran with a dark sense of humor. It wouldn't have been the first time a backcountry posting had unofficial traditions attached to it. I photographed the rule again, separately this time, and wrote in the margin of my arrival notes, possible prank monitor. Then I read Rule 11. Rule 11 read, when leaving the outpost, produce 2 short whistle tones before stepping outside. This is your departure signal for the duty log. If you hear those same 2 tones from outside the outpost, before you have produced them yourself, do not step outside. Secure the door from the interior and initiate emergency protocol. I stood very still for a moment. 2 rules about whistling. One said, never whistle. One said, always whistle before leaving, but only in a specific way, and only if nothing outside had already whistled it first. They weren't contradictory in the way that a mistake is contradictory. They were contradictory in the way that a trap is designed 2 different protocols for 2 different situations, both involving the same sound, written by someone who understood a distinction that I didn't yet. I wrote in my duty log, rules unusual, apparent internal contradiction in Rules 7 and 11. We'll monitor for context. What I should have written was, someone wrote these rules because they needed to. Find out why before dark. I read the remaining non-standard rules before I unpacked my gear. Rule 8. Motion sensor station 4 will occasionally trigger without identifiable cause. Do not investigate station 4 alone after dark. Do not investigate station 4 at all if the duty log records more than 2 triggers in a single night. Leave all station 4 activity for morning review. Rule 9. If a visitor or hiker approaches the outpost after 2100 hours requesting assistance, do not open the exterior door. Direct them to the emergency call box mounted on the south exterior wall. If they report that the call box is non-functional, it is functional. Do not open the door. Rule 10. Personal items found on trail, clothing, packs, water bottles, or any other belongings must be tagged in place and photographed. Do not carry found items back to the outpost overnight. Do not bring them inside. Rule 12. The observation deck is for daylight use and evening weather monitoring only. Do not use the deck between 0200 and 0430 hours. If you find the deck door open during those hours, close it from the interior without stepping outside. Log it. Move away from the exterior windows. And Rule 6, which I had skimmed initially and now read carefully. If your radio produces a voice transmission you did not initiate and cannot attribute to District HQ on the designated frequency, do not respond. Switch to Channel 9, key the mic 3 times, and wait for HQ confirmation. If HQ does not confirm within 4 minutes, the transmission did not originate from HQ. I stepped back from the wall and looked at all 12 rules as a complete document. Individually, each non-standard rule could be explained away. Station 4, triggering without cause. Faulty sensor. Don't bring trail items inside contamination protocol, pest control, basic hygiene practice. Don't open the door after dark remote posting, Lone Ranger, standard safety boundary. But together, they formed something I couldn't dismiss as easily. Every single non-standard rule described an approach, something coming toward the outpost, something that communicated, something that used familiar signals, voices, sounds, distress calls, in ways that required a trained ranger to override every instinct they had about helping people. These rules weren't written around wildlife. They weren't written around weather events or equipment failure, or any of the other practical hazards a backcountry posting generates. They were written around a specific type of encounter. One type, and whoever wrote them had experienced it more than once. I made coffee in the kitchen and stood at the window, looking at the tree line until the light changed. The first full day was exactly what I'd signed up for. I was on the lower Ridgeback Trail by 7:15. Pack on, clipboard out, running the first wildlife population transect of the posting. The protocol was straightforward. Walk the designated survey corridor, record all wildlife sign within 10 meters of the trail centerline, photograph track sets, note habitat conditions, log everything in the survey grid by species and location. I found fresh white-tailed deer tracks in the mud along the creek crossing at Marker 7 a doe, and what looked like a yearling, moving south toward the lower hollow. Black bear, scat, near the deadfall cluster at Marker 12. Recent, full of persimmon seed. A red fox den entrance in the root mass of a fallen tulip poplar at the creek's second bend, with fresh digging around the entrance, suggesting active use. I recorded all of it. I photographed what I could. I moved through the transect with the kind of focused attention that fieldwork demands, and I felt, for the first time in 2 years of desk work, like a ranger rather than an administrator. The forest in daylight was everything the drive up the fire road had suggested it might be. Clear air, cold enough to keep you moving, the canopy still thick enough to filter the light into something that fell in long, angled shafts through the branches. The creek ran clean over pale limestone. The trail was soft underfoot from recent rain. I was good at this. That's not arrogance. It's the specific comfort of trained competence in a familiar environment. I knew what I was looking for, and I knew how to find it. And the morning rewarded that knowledge at every survey point. I almost forgot about the rulebook entirely. Almost. Station 4 was on my morning patrol route. I found it at the end of a short spur trail off the main Ridgeback corridor, about 40 minutes from the outpost on foot. A motion-activated wildlife monitoring sensor mounted on a treated hemlock post at the edge of a natural depression in the terrain. The depression was roughly oval, maybe 60 yards across at its widest, formed by the convergence of two low ridgelines that curved together like cupped hands. The floor of the depression was thick with moss and fern, damp and dark even in full morning light. I stepped into it and immediately understood why the rule had specified this location by name. Sound did something strange in there. My footsteps on the mossy ground produced an echo that arrived late. Not the immediate echo of a hard surface, but a delayed return, like the sound had traveled further than the physical distance of the depression walls should have allowed. I scuffed my boot deliberately and counted. The echo came back almost a full second behind the original. I spoke a single word out loud. Just my name, quietly, and heard it return to me slightly lower in pitch than I'd said it. Acoustic anomaly. I knew the terminology. Mountain terrain creates pockets of irregular sound behavior all the time. Inversions, reflections, resonance effects from specific geological formations. This was a documented phenomenon. The bowl's shape and the surrounding ridgeline geometry were creating a natural amplification and delay effect. I recorded it in my field notes as an environmental observation. I checked the sensor unit housing intact. Battery indicator green. Trigger log showing no recent activity on the current seasonal sheet. Everything normal. I took one more look at the depression before I left. The moss was undisturbed. The fern fronds were still. A thin thread of fog clung to the lowest point of the bowl's floor, unmoving in the still air. It was a beautiful and slightly strange place. In daylight, that was all it was. I was back at the outpost by 4:30. Radio check-in with District HQ at 1700 hours, as scheduled. The dispatcher who answered was a woman named Carla. Efficient, professional, the kind of radio voice that conveys competence without warmth. We exchanged call signs. I confirmed my position and status. She noted my check-in in the district log, and that was the extent of it. 40 seconds, beginning to end. I made dinner, reviewed the topographic maps for the next day's patrol route, and checked the weather forecast on the satellite receiver. A clear week ahead, temperatures dropping toward freezing by night, 3 or 4. Good conditions for the survey work. I wrote my first duty log entry at 1900 hours. Personnel on station, weather observed. Wildlife survey data from the morning transect. Radio check-in confirmed. I noted the acoustic anomaly at Station 4 as an environmental observation. I noted the supplemental protocols as reviewed and understood. I did not note that they had unsettled me. That wasn't the kind of thing that went in a duty log. I went to bed at 2100. The outpost was quiet, in the specific way of buildings. In remote places, the generator hum from the equipment shed outside. the occasional pop of the metal roof cooling in the night air, the creak sound from the hollow below, if the wind came from the right direction. I dreamed about my brother Connor. This was not unusual. I'd dreamed about Connor with some regularity for 12 years, since the summer I was 19 and he was 17. And he went into the woods on a camping trip in the mountains of western North Carolina and didn't come back out. The dreams were never dramatic. In most of them, he was simply present, standing nearby, or sitting across a table, or walking ahead of me on a trail. Sometimes I could hear him, and sometimes I couldn't. Sometimes I knew in the dream that he was gone, and sometimes I didn't. That first night at Chimney Hollow, he was walking ahead of me on a trail I didn't recognize. I called his name. He didn't turn around. I woke up at 2 a.m, lay still for a few minutes, listening to the generator hum and the pop of the roof, and then went back to sleep. It was a normal night. Day 3 was not. By day 3, I had stopped thinking about the rulebook in any active way. That's the honest account of it. I'd read the rules, I'd noted them, I'd spent the first evening turning them over in my mind, looking for the rational context that would make them make sense. By day 2, the fieldwork had crowded. Most of that out, there's a particular quality of focused attention that survey work demands, a present tense absorption that doesn't leave much room for background anxiety. By the morning of day 3, the laminated sheet on the equipment wall had become part of the visual landscape of the outpost in the way that things do when you see them constantly without incident. I was running equipment inventory in the rear storage room that afternoon, checking stock on trail markers, first aid supplies, radio battery spares, the water filtration cartridges that Pruitt had flagged for week 3 replacement. I had my clipboard, and I was working through the checklist methodically, counting items on the shelves and cross-referencing the posted quantities. And I was whistling. I didn't notice I was doing it. That's the part I need you to understand, because it's the part that matters most. It wasn't a decision. It wasn't carelessness in any conscious sense. It was the way you whistle when you're doing repetitive work alone. The melody surfaces on its own. 4 notes from a song I've known since I was a child. Something my mother used to hum in the kitchen. I'd been whistling it for probably a full minute before some background part of my brain surfaced the relevant information. I stopped. The storage room went quiet. I stood there with my clipboard at my side, facing the shelf of radio batteries, and I looked at the wall between the storage room and the main room, behind which the laminated rulebook was mounted. And then I looked at the exterior wall of the storage room, which faced the tree line. 30 feet of air and lumber and insulation between me and the outside. I waited. 30 seconds. A minute. 2 minutes. The generator hummed. The roof creaked once. Nothing else. I almost relaxed. I was almost ready to note it in my log as a non-incident and move on with my inventory. Then I heard it. 4 notes. My melody, my rhythm, my pitch. From somewhere in the tree line, not far. 60 yards, maybe less. The sound was clear enough that distance felt almost irrelevant. Whatever produced it was close enough that I could hear the tonal quality of it. And the tonal quality was wrong, in a way I couldn't name immediately. and spent a long time naming afterward. It wasn't an echo. I understood echoes. I'd spent the previous morning in the acoustic bowl at Station 4, deliberately producing sounds and studying their returns. An echo fades. An echo arrives late and diminished, a copy that degrades with distance. This did neither. It arrived after a pause that felt less like acoustic delay and more like consideration. And it didn't fade. The 4 notes were delivered at the same volume, the same steadiness, beginning to end. The way you'd whistle a phrase if you wanted someone to know you'd heard them clearly. I did not move. My first coherent thought was another ranger, someone from district, maybe, or a trail crew I hadn't been notified about, passing through the backcountry corridor. People whistle. It's a reasonable human behavior. 4 notes from a common melody isn't statistically improbable if another person is within earshot. My second thought arrived about 4 seconds after the first, and it was quieter and more certain. There is no other ranger for 7 miles. The duty roster shows no trail crew scheduled for this corridor this week. I am alone on this station. The third thought was just the rulebook. If you hear a whistle that is not your own, do not respond to it. Do not repeat it. I didn't respond. I didn't repeat it. I stood in the storage room with both hands on my clipboard, and I did not make a single sound. And the tree line outside the exterior wall did not produce another one either. After 4 minutes, I counted, I walked to the main room, sat at the work desk, and opened my duty log to Section 7. My hands weren't steady. I noticed that the way you notice a physical symptom, you'd prefer not to have clinically, at a slight remove, filing it as data rather than feeling. I set the clipboard down and held both hands flat on the desk surface until they stopped. Then I wrote the entry. Section 7. Unusual Occurrence Log. Day 3, approximately 15:47 hours. While conducting interior equipment inventory, inadvertently produced a 4-note melodic whistle within the storage room. Western exterior wall, adjacent to tree line. Approximately 90 seconds after whistle, a matching 4-note melodic response was received from the direction of the tree line, estimated 50 to 70 meters north-northwest of the outpost structure. Response matched original whistle in pitch, rhythm, and duration. No other personnel scheduled for this corridor. No identifiable wildlife species capable of precise melodic mimicry known to inhabit this region. Rule 7. Protocol followed, no response produced. Current position maintained. Entry filed per supplemental protocol. I read what I'd written. It sounded insane. It was the most clinical, controlled piece of writing I'd ever produced, and it described something that had no clinical, controlled explanation. I noticed, for the first time, that there were more Section 7 entries in the duty log below the current page. Previous postings. Previous rangers. I hadn't looked at them when I'd reviewed the log on arrival, because they'd been below the current seasonal entry point, and I hadn't thought to scroll back. I scrolled back. There were 12 of them. I read all 12 previous Section 7 entries that evening. The oldest one in the current duty log binder was from a ranger named D. Acosta, posted 3 autumns before mine. The entry was brief. Melodic sound from tree line, approximately 2,000 hours, following accidental vocal humming during exterior perimeter check. Sound matched original in pitch and pattern. Rule 7 followed. No further incident that evening. The next entry was from a ranger I couldn't identify. By name, the signature was illegible. The entry was longer, more specific. The ranger had been on the observation deck at dusk when they'd produced what they described as an absent whistle. Habitual, unintentional. The return had come from the direction of what they called the bowl station 4's acoustic depression. They'd timed the response, 40 seconds after their whistle, which was not an acoustic echo, but a delivered reply. The entries varied in length and in the composure of the person writing them. Some were as controlled as mine. A few were not. One, dated 2 seasons back, read, "Do not whistle." I cannot stress this with adequate force using the tools available in a duty log. Whatever you think the rule means, it means more than that. Do not whistle. That entry had no follow-up. The seasonal log moved to standard entries after it, as if the ranger had decided to stop putting anything in Section 7, regardless of what occurred. 12 entries. 12 different rangers, across what appeared to be multiple years of seasonal rotations, all describing variations of the same event. A whistle, produced without thinking. A whistle, returned with precision. The cold arithmetic of a thing that waits for you to forget the rule before you've been there long enough to really believe it. I closed the duty log and sat at the desk for a long time. Outside, the generator hummed. The darkness past the window was complete, no moon that night, and the cloud cover had moved in after sunset, sealing off the stars. The tree line was invisible. Everything past the outpost's exterior lights was solid black. I got up and checked that the exterior door was locked. It was. It had been locked since I came inside at 4:30. I went and stood in front of the rulebook on the equipment wall, and I read all 12 rules again, in order, slowly, the way you read a document when you finally understand that the person who wrote it was serious. I found it on the Ridgeback Trail at midday on day 4. I was running the upper survey corridor, the section that climbs the north face of the hollow's eastern ridge, steeper than the lower route, less traveled, the trail surface scattered with leaf fall and occasional blowdown from the previous month's wind event. I was clearing a small deadfall across the path, noting it in the maintenance log for formal removal on a later patrol, when I saw it in the leaf litter approximately 2 feet off the trail edge. A child's whistle, plastic, orange, roughly 3 inches long, the molded kind that comes in a bag of outdoor party favors or gets clipped to a child's backpack zipper as a safety item. On one side of it, raised in the plastic, was a small cartoon bear. The paint on the bear was worn, but the whistle itself was intact. No visible cracks. I crouched and looked at it without touching it. Rule 10 was immediate in my mind. Tag in place, photograph, report at next scheduled check-in. Do not bring found items back to the outpost overnight. I photographed it. I entered it in the trail maintenance log with GPS coordinates and a physical description. I pulled a flagging tag from my pack, wrote the date and the item description, and tied it to a nearby branch at eye level. Standard lost property procedure. Clean. Correct. I stood up. I looked at the whistle again. The orange color was a particular shade, a specific warm orange that sat somewhere between safety orange and the orange of old traffic cones. The cartoon bear had a rounded face with 2 dot eyes and a small, curved mouth. The bear mid-stride, one paw raised. I knew that whistle. Not the specific object I understood that much, but the design was identical to the one my brother Connor had carried on every camping trip from the time he was 8 years old until he was 17. My mother had bought a 3-pack of them at an outdoor supply store and clipped one to each of our packs every time we went into the woods, in the specific way that mothers of children who love forests handle the fact that forests are sometimes dangerous. Connor had kept his long past the age when a child's safety whistle is practical. He thought it was funny. He'd blow it occasionally on trails, that high, thin plastic sound, and my mother would pretend to be annoyed. The whistle on the trail was not Connor's whistle. Connor's whistle was somewhere in the mountains of western North Carolina, along with everything else he'd been carrying on that last trip. I knew this. I was a grown man with a graduate degree and a ranger's field certification, and I stood on a trail in the Smoky Mountains and knew with complete rational certainty that this was not my brother's whistle. I put it in my jacket pocket. I told myself it was because the flagging procedure might not hold in the weather, and the whistle was small enough to be missed on a follow-up sweep. I told myself I'd log it properly when I got back to the outpost and figure out a better preservation method. I told myself a number of things on the way back down the trail that I didn't entirely believe. I hung my jacket on the hook beside the exterior door when I got back to the outpost. I made coffee, reviewed the afternoon survey data, ran the 1700 radio check-in with Carla, ate dinner. The jacket stayed on the hook. At some point during the evening, I thought about the whistle in the pocket and made a note to address the logging irregularity in the morning, to go back to the trail location with a better evidence bag and a formal found property form. At 2100 hours, I went to get my jacket. The exterior pocket, the right side lower pocket where I'd put the whistle, was empty. I checked the left pocket. Empty. I checked the interior pockets, both of them. The breast pocket, the pocket along the hood seam that I sometimes use without thinking. I took the jacket off the hook and shook it. Nothing fell out. I checked the floor below the hook, a 2-foot radius, on my hands and knees with my flashlight. Bare floorboards. I stood up. The kitchen table was 6 feet away, across the main room. I hadn't been near it since dinner. I had not put anything on it after eating because I'd washed the dishes immediately, the way I always do when I'm alone and a small space mess accumulates fast, and I don't tolerate it well. The child's whistle was sitting in the center of the kitchen table. Orange plastic, cartoon bear, 2 dot eyes, 1 paw raised. I stood in the main room of the outpost with my jacket in my hands, and I looked at the whistle on the table, and I ran through the complete inventory of explanations available to me. I had taken it out of my pocket before hanging the jacket and set it on the table without registering the action. I had put it down somewhere else, and it had no. I went through all of them. I took my time. I was thorough. None of them held. The outpost was locked, had been locked since my return at 16:30. No windows were open. The temperature had dropped below 40 after sunset, and I'd secured everything before starting dinner. I was the only person in the building. I had not been near the kitchen table since I'd wiped it down after eating. At approximately 18:15, 45 minutes before I'd returned from the trail and hung my jacket on the hook, the whistle had moved. Between the jacket pocket and the kitchen table, in a locked building, with no person present capable of moving it. I picked it up. I don't know why. I've asked myself that many times in the 11 months since, and I don't have a satisfying answer. It was sitting there in the middle of the table, looking like an object that wanted to be held. And I picked it up, and I held it in my palm for a long moment. The plastic, warm from something that shouldn't have been touching it. Then I set it back down in the center of the table and went to sit on the cot in the sleeping quarters with my back against the wall and the door open so I could see the kitchen. I watched the table until I fell asleep. The whistle was in the same position when I woke up, but the feeling that the room had been used while I wasn't looking had settled into the walls of the outpost like moisture, and I couldn't shake it after that. The knock came at 22:30. 3 slow impacts on the exterior door. The kind of knock that a person makes when they've been walking for a long time and their hands are cold and they're not sure anyone is inside to hear them. I was at the desk, writing in my personal journal. I stopped writing. I looked at the exterior door from across the room. The door was solid core wood with a single small window, 6 inches by 6 inches, reinforced glass, set at eye level. The exterior light above the door was on. Through the small window, I could see the outer edge of the concrete step and nothing else. A man's voice. Hoarse, frightened in the specific way of someone who has been frightened for a while and is trying to manage it. "Hello? Is someone there? I need help." I was halfway out of my chair before I stopped myself. Rule 9. If a visitor or hiker approaches the outpost after 2100 hours requesting assistance, do not open the exterior door. I sat back down. My chest was tight. Every training protocol I'd completed in 6 years of wildlife management education, every search and rescue orientation, every ranger field ethics course, all of it was pointing at that door and saying, "Open it." "I'm injured," the voice said. "My ankle. I can't. I got separated from my group on the upper ridgeback. I've been walking for 3 hours." I called out through the door without opening it. "I hear you. There's an emergency call box on the south exterior wall. Please use it to initiate contact. I'll respond through the box." A pause. I saw it. "It's broken. The screen is dark. It's not. Please, I need help. It's freezing out here." I crossed to the interior panel on the south wall, the monitoring board that included a status indicator for the exterior call box. The indicator was green, active, functioning. The call box was not broken. I went back to the door. "The call box is operational," I said. "Please use it. I can walk you through the interface." Silence for a long moment. Then, "Why won't you open the door?" The question was wrong in a way I felt before I could explain. Not the words were reasonable. The wrongness was in the tone. The fear had left it. The hoarseness was still there, but the fear that had been underneath the hoarseness, the specific, exhausted desperation of an injured person who has been alone in the cold for 3 hours, was gone. What replaced it was something flatter, attentive, patient. I stepped back from the door. I pressed my back against the equipment wall, and I did not speak again, and I did not move to the door, and the exterior light above the step held its small circle of yellow against the darkness, and I waited. At 22:48, the voice said one more thing. Okay? A pause that lasted about 4 seconds. I'll find another way. Then, nothing. I sat with my back against the equipment wall for 40 minutes after that. Not against the exterior wall, against the interior equipment wall. The one with the rulebook on it. The one that shared no surface with the outside. I sat on the floor with my knees up and my flashlight in my hand, and I listened to the generator hum and the silence where the voice had been. When I finally moved, it was to the side window, not the door window, the narrow casement window on the east wall that offered an angled view of the exterior door's south side. I looked out from the very edge of the frame, keeping my face back from the glass. The concrete step below the exterior door was visible in the spillover from the exterior light. No one was standing on it. Nothing was visible within the light's reach. I angled my view down to the ground below the step, to the strip of bare earth between the concrete and the gravel of the clearing that always held moisture and took impressions easily. There were marks in it, impressions in the soft earth, beginning at the step and leading toward the south wall and the call box, several of them, close together, the spacing of something that had approached slowly. They were not boot prints. The shape was wrong. Too narrow at the base, too elongated at the forward edge. The depth uneven in a way that didn't correspond to the weight distribution of a bipedal human walking on an injured ankle or any other ankle. I looked at them for a long time from the edge of the window frame. Then I went back to the equipment wall and stood in front of the rulebook, and I read Rule 9 one more time, and I understood that the rule had not been written to be cautious. It had been written by someone who had opened the door. I did not sleep that night, and in the morning, I needed answers that the outpost itself couldn't give me. I radioed District HQ at 800 hours the next morning. Carla answered on the second transmission. Professional, efficient, the same flat competence she brought to every check-in. I confirmed my status, passed along the previous day's survey data, and then, as neutrally as I could manage, asked about the supplemental protocols. The laminated sheet on the equipment wall at Chimney Hollow, I said, the non-standard rules, 6 through 12. I'd like to know who authorized them, and whether there's supporting documentation in the district records. A pause, shorter than it should have been. Those protocols are standard for remote backcountry stations, Carla said. They're not, I said. I've worked 3 other remote postings, and none of them had rules of this type. I'd like to see the authorization paperwork. Another pause. I'll leave a message for Supervisor Aldrin. He can address it at his next available. Can you give me a timeline on that? I'll note it as non-urgent. The line held its static for a moment. I was about to key the mic again when it happened. A voice. Not Carla's. Not the standard HQ frequency cadence. A different voice, male, steady, issuing from my radio on the active channel. Mercer, we've had a sensor alert on your Station 4 unit. Go ahead and run a physical check on the hardware. Make sure the housing is secure. I looked at the radio. I looked at the laminated sheet on the wall. Rule 6. If your radio produces a voice transmission, you did not initiate and cannot attribute to District HQ on the designated frequency, do not respond. Switch to Channel 9, key the mic 3 times, and wait for HQ confirmation. I switched to Channel 9, keyed 3 times, waited. 4 minutes of static. No HQ confirmation. The transmission had not come from HQ, and Station 4, which I had not been directed to investigate, was 300 yards from where I slept. I put the radio down and picked up the satellite emergency contact list. Pruitt's personal number was at the bottom, marked Outgoing Seasonal Emergency Contact Only. I called it. She answered on the second ring. Pruitt. It's Mercer, Chimney Hollow. A silence that lasted exactly long enough to tell me she'd been expecting this call at some point. Not surprised. Prepared. How many days in? She said. 5. Have you been whistling? The question landed like a hand on my shoulder in a dark room. Unexpected and too accurate. Day 3, I said. In the storage room. Something in the tree line returned it. She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. Registered. Still controlled. But the professional distance had come down slightly. The way it comes down between people who have shared something they can't explain to anyone else. Did you respond to it? No. I followed Rule 7. Good. A breath. What else? I told her about the whistle on the kitchen table, the knock at 22:30, the voice, the call box, the impressions, and the earth below the step. I gave it to her in chronological order, the way I'd write it in a report, keeping my voice even. She didn't interrupt. She listened the way someone listens when they're confirming, not when they're learning. When I finished, she said, "You did everything right." I'd like to understand what I did everything right about, I said. The supplemental protocols don't include any explanation of why the rules exist. There's no supporting documentation in the district records, apparently. I need to know what I'm dealing with. Another pause. Longer. I wrote 3 of those rules myself, she said, after my first week at that posting. The generator hummed outside. The morning light was flat and gray through the windows, cloud cover moving in from the west. Which 3? I said. The door rule, the call box clause specifically that was mine, the observation deck hours. And I added the sentence in Rule 7 about not repeating the whistle if you hear it back. The original version just said, "Don't whistle." It didn't address what to do when it whistles at you. I sat with that for a moment. A ranger with 15 years of service, and presumably an equal measure of professional skepticism, had been at this posting long enough to experience the knocking, long enough to learn that the thing outside would claim the call box was broken, long enough to add a specific behavioral clause to an official document based on direct encounter. How long were you there? I said. The full 6 weeks, she said. Both rotations I've done. And you went back for a second one. Someone had to. There was nothing I could say to that would have been adequate, so I didn't say anything. "Mercer," she said, "there's a metal strongbox in the equipment shed, back corner, under the blue tarp. Read what's in it before dark tonight." Before she hung up, she told me about the learning problem. She'd been reluctant to use that phrase, she said. It sounded imprecise, and imprecision bothered her. But she'd spent 2 full rotations at Chimney Hollow, and 12 months of afterward, trying to find more accurate language for what she'd observed. And the learning problem was still the best she had. Whatever lived in the territory around Chimney Hollow was not operating on instinct. It wasn't a predator following hardwired behavioral programming. It was adaptive. It observed. It incorporated what it observed into new behavior in a way that demonstrated retention and application, which is to say, it learned, in the functional sense of that word, across encounters and across time. It had learned radio communication, not the concept, the specifics, frequencies, call protocols, the cadence of individual voices. She'd realized this when it had transmitted something on her station's active channel in a voice she'd recognized as her district supervisor's, the inflection precise enough that she'd almost responded before she'd remembered the rule. It had learned the departure whistle. She'd added the clause about not repeating it back before she'd understood exactly what the thing was doing with that information. Later, she'd understood. It was cataloging the safe signal, storing it. The departure whistle was a predictive behavior. If a ranger whistled before stepping outside, the ranger was about to be outside. The thing was mapping the protocols. "That's what took me the longest to accept," she said. "It doesn't just work around the rules. It studies them. It's been watching rangers follow those protocols for long enough that it knows what the rules predict about our behavior. And it's been learning how to use that against us." I was standing very still in the middle of the main room. "How long?" I said. "The logbooks in the strongbox go back to 1991, she said. "That's 30 years of seasonal rotations. 30 years of rangers following those protocols. 30 years of it watching." The last thing she said before she hung up was the thing I kept coming back to in the days that followed. "The worst moment of my second rotation," she said, "was the morning I realized it was getting better at being me than I was, at predicting what I'd do, at sounding like me, at knowing what I needed to hear." She paused. "It's patient, Mercer. Whatever you think you're dealing with, add patience to it. It has been at that hollow longer than the outpost has been there. It was learning before we started writing rules about it, and every ranger who's followed the protocols has taught it something new." The line went to static. I held the satellite phone for a long moment after the connection dropped. Then I went to find the equipment shed. The equipment shed was a separate structure, 20 yards behind the main outpost building, accessible through the rear clearing. I found the strongbox, where Pruitt had said it would be, back corner of the shed, under a blue poly tarp, weighted down at the edges by lengths of chain. The box was metal, dark green, like the outpost walls, roughly the size of a shoebox, but heavier. The hasp was not locked. Inside, 7 duty logbooks, the kind the Park Service has used for decades. Hard-covered, spiral-bound, the cover printed with the department seal, and a field for the posting location and seasonal dates. Each one had Chimney Hollow handwritten on the location line. The dates ranged from the 1991 to 92 autumn season to the 2021 to 22 season, with a few gaps in the sequence that I noted but couldn't account for. I carried all 7 books back to the outpost, set them on the work desk in chronological order, and started with the oldest. The first logbook opened with standard entries, wildlife survey data, weather observations, maintenance logs, radio check-ins. Neat handwriting, professional, controlled. The ranger's name on the cover was R. Tennyson, and Tennyson wrote the way a veteran writes, economical, precise, the minimum words necessary to accurately convey the required information. The standard entries held for the first 9 days of Tennyson's posting. On day 10, there was a Section 7 entry, the whistling, the return from the tree line. Tennyson's entry was 3 sentences, the last of which was underlined. Protocol followed. No response produced. This rule is not a joke. I moved through the remaining books in order. Each one had the same structure, normal entries, then a Section 7 that described a variation of the same encounter. Some of the rangers had been more forthcoming in their Section 7 entries than others. A few had written multiple paragraphs. One had written a single word, and then moved on. 3 of the logbooks had pages near the end that were water damaged, the ink blurred and the paper warped. Whatever had been written in those pages reduced to illegible gray smearing. I didn't know if the damage was old rain or something else, and I found I didn't want to speculate. And then I reached the 2019 to 20 logbook, Marcus Webb's posting. Marcus Webb had been a career ranger, 16 years of service, according to the brief personnel summary he'd written on the logbook's inside front cover, a habit, maybe, or a protocol specific to solo postings. Name, service years, emergency contacts, blood type. The kind of summary that made practical sense for a ranger operating alone in a location with limited outside access. His daily entries were the most detailed I'd encountered in any of the 7 logbooks. Webb wrote with the precision of someone who believed in comprehensive documentation as a professional discipline. Weather data to the decimal. Wildlife observations with GPS coordinates and behavioral notations. Equipment status in thorough daily review. His Section 7 entries were equally detailed. The first one appeared on day 4, and it was the clearest account of the whistling event I'd read in any of the logs. He described the melody, the timing, the acoustic qualities of the return, the delay between his whistle and the response. He noted that the response was not consistent with the acoustic properties of the surrounding terrain. He had, like me, visited Station 4 and documented the bull's echo behavior. And the return whistle from the tree line was distinct from what that terrain should have produced. His entries continued through day 7. He described the knock, the voice, the call box claim. He described the station 4 triggers, 4 times on day 6, 7 times on day 7. He wrote about the radio transmission he'd nearly responded to. And then, on day 8, he wrote something I hadn't found in any of the other logbooks. The figure was on the ridgeline again, at approximately 0320. Observation deck door had been open when I woke. Secured per protocol, without stepping outside. Before closing it, I observed the figure's position more carefully than previous nights. It has not moved from the same location across 3 nights of observation. It stands at the edge of the tree line on the eastern ridge, at the highest point of the bowl's perimeter. I have been attempting to calculate the acoustic geometry from that position using the bowl's reflection properties. It knows my name. I have not said my name out loud since arriving at this station. I have not transmitted it over radio. I use my call sign as per protocol. The name is on no posted document inside the outpost. At 03:47 hours, the figure on the ridgeline spoke my name, Marcus. Once, clearly, at a volume that carried across 300 yards of open hollow, as if there were no distance at all. I don't know how it knows my name. The final entry in Webb's Section 7 log was dated 2 days after that. 2 words. It waited. Below the entry, the rest of the page was blank. The logbook continued with standard entries for the remaining days of Webb's posting, survey data, maintenance notes, check-ins, the ordinary mechanical record of a ranger doing his job. But the Section 7 addendum was never used again. Whatever Webb had understood on the day he wrote those 2 words, he had decided to stop documenting it. I sat with his logbook for a long time. It knew names. It had learned Marcus Webb's name through means I couldn't identify, and it had used that name from 300 yards away at 3 in the morning, from the same position it had occupied for 3 consecutive nights. I thought about what Pruitt had said. 30 years of seasonal rotations. 30 years of learning. I thought about how much a patient, adaptive thing could learn in 30 years about the specific people sent to this outpost. The information available about a ranger through their radio communications, through their habits, through what they called out loud when they thought they were alone, through what they mourned. I closed Webb's logbook and looked at the wall. I was still at the desk at 2100 hours when the monitoring panel chimed. A single tone, the alert signal for motion sensor activity. The panel display showed the source, Station 4. I noted it in the log. 1 trigger, 21:03 hours. At 21:40, the panel chimed again. Station 4. 2nd trigger, I noted it. Kept reading the logbooks. At 22:03, the 3rd chime. Rule 8. Do not investigate Station 4 at all if the duty log records more than 2 triggers in a single night. 3 triggers. I was not going to Station 4 tonight. I logged the 3rd trigger, closed the logbook I'd been reading, and stood up from the desk. The monitoring panel was on the east wall, the wall that faced in the general direction of the hollow and the ridgeline beyond it. I stood in front of it and looked at the Station 4 indicator, a small amber light that had cycled 3 times and was now quiet. 300 yards. That was the distance from the outpost to the acoustic bowl. I knew it from my morning patrol. In daylight, 300 yards of mixed forest felt like a comfortable buffer. At 2200 hours, with no moon and solid cloud cover, 300 yards was simply the distance between the exterior wall I was standing next to and the darkness. I went to the side window, stood at the edge of the frame, looked out toward the eastern tree line, the way I'd trained myself to look not directly, using the peripheral field where the eye captures movement and low light more effectively than straight on. Nothing visible, just the dark margin of the hemlock and spruce at the edge of the outpost clearing, the pale gravel of the clearing itself under the exterior lights. And beyond the lights, nothing. I stood there for approximately 2 minutes. Then, from the direction of Station 4's acoustic bowl, carried across 300 yards of cold night air with the same impossible clarity I'd come to recognize, I heard 2 short notes. My departure whistle, the safe signal, the one I'd been producing every morning before stepping outside. 2 short tones, the specific rhythm I'd established on day 1 without thinking about it, the habitual 2-note phrase that meant I was about to leave the building. It knew the departure whistle. It had been watching me leave the outpost every morning for 5 days, and it had learned the safe signal, and it was producing it now from the position it occupied in the acoustic bowl 300 yards away in the dark. I stepped back from the window. Pruitt's voice in my memory. It was getting better at being me than I was. I had 3 nights left before my scheduled extraction. I went to the sleeping quarters, sat on the cot with my back to the wall, and the door open to the main room. And I began calculating what the next 3 nights might require of me. By day 7, I was running on 2 to 3 hours of sleep a night. This is not a complaint. It's relevant information. Sleep deprivation at that level doesn't produce hallucination, not in the first week. But it produces a specific kind of cognitive friction, a half-second lag between stimulus and processing that I was very aware of and very worried about. The rules required precision. The rules required me to hear something and identify it correctly and respond in the correct sequence without hesitation. Fatigue was a direct threat to that precision. I was maintaining the duty log, completing the morning patrols, the survey transects, the equipment checks, doing the job. Carla at District HQ received my check-ins at the scheduled times and detected nothing in my voice worth flagging, which meant either I was performing competence well enough to pass, or she wasn't listening for the specific frequency of a ranger who has spent 4 nights sitting with their back to a wall, waiting for a departure whistle from the dark. I had tried Pruitt again twice. No answer either time. I had left a message that said, "Call me when you can," and did not elaborate. On the morning of day 7, I drafted a formal request for early extraction, citing a personal emergency. I kept it vague family circumstances requiring return. Apologized for the disruption to the rotation schedule. I submitted it through the HQ radio at the scheduled check-in. Carla said she would process it and noted that standard processing time was 48 hours. I had 72 hours left in the standard posting. I did the math. If extraction processing ran to the full 48 hours, I would have 24 hours of cushion. If it ran longer administrative delays, scheduling conflicts, the particular bureaucratic drag that remote posting logistics often produced, the extraction might not arrive before the standard rotation end date anyway. I was going to be at Chimney Hollow for at least 2 more nights, regardless. I went on the afternoon patrol, ran the survey corridor, logged the data, returned to the outpost before 1600 hours. I ate. I reviewed the logbooks again. I read the rulebook again. Night 7 came in cold and clear, the first truly clear sky of the posting, and the moon was up and nearly full. And in any other circumstance, I would have stood on the observation deck and appreciated it. I did not go near the observation deck. At 23:30, the radio produced an unauthorized transmission. I was at the desk. I heard the channel activate the specific click and static shift of an incoming signal, and I looked at the frequency display, District HQ channel. But I had not initiated contact, and the next scheduled check-in was at 0600. The voice was Frank Aldrin, District Supervisor. I had spoken to Aldrin twice during the posting, once on day 2, when he'd called in to confirm my arrival and run through a brief orientation, and once on day 5, when he'd called to address a routine administrative point about the wildlife survey data formatting. I knew his voice. I knew the way he dropped the endings of words slightly, a pattern that might have been a regional thing, or might have been a habit from years of radio communication, where full enunciation was less important than clarity of the key information. I knew the cadence of his sentences. The voice on the radio had all of it, every phonetic habit, every rhythm. Mercer, we've had a report of a fire road incident near the station boundary, possible vehicle off-road situation. Go ahead and verify the motion sensor hardware at Station 4 is recording correctly. We may need that data. I did not move. My hand was on the desk surface, 12 inches from the radio's transmit key. In the time it had taken to process what I'd just heard, my hand had moved on its own toward the key. A trained reflex, the automatic response to a supervisor's transmission. I looked at the rulebook on the wall. Rule 6. I pulled my hand back from the key. I switched to channel 9. I keyed the mic 3 times. I set the radio down and looked at the clock on the wall panel and counted. 4 minutes. The static held. Channel 9 produced nothing from HQ. I switched back to the district channel. It was quiet. The transmission had not been from Aldrin. The voice I had recognized in the specific way you recognize someone you've spoken to. The voice with all the correct phonetic habits and cadences had not come from the district office. It had come from somewhere close enough to reach my radio, and it had known Aldrin's voice well enough to replicate it, and it had told me to go to Station 4. I sat in the chair for a long time after the 4 minutes ended. The radio sat on the equipment table and produced nothing else. The generator hummed. The moonlight came through the south window and made a pale rectangle on the floor of the main room. And I sat in the chair at the desk and looked at the rulebook on the wall, and I understood something I hadn't fully understood before. This thing had been listening to my radio calls for 7 days. It had heard Aldrin's voice twice, 2 conversations, and it had learned enough from 2 conversations to replicate the voice with precision sufficient to make a trained ranger's hand move toward the transmit key. 2 conversations. Pruitt had said 30 years. I thought about what 30 years of radio communication could teach something that learned the way this thing learned. I thought about what else it had been learning for 30 years. At 0100, I got up from the desk and read the rulebook again. the 4th time I'd read it since arrival. The reading was different this time, not the skeptical first read, not the shaken second read, not the grim confirmatory third read. This time I read it the way Pruitt had taught me to read it, without knowing she was teaching me anything, as a document about behavior. Specifically, the entity's behavior, as observed and recorded by people who had survived long enough to write it down. I took a pen from the desk and a piece of blank paper and wrote out every action verb in the non-standard rules. Approaches, requests, claims, produces, triggers, positions, waits. 7 verbs. Each one describing an action the entity initiated. Each one describing a different vector of engagement, physical approach, verbal request, false claim, acoustic production, sensor activation, positional staging, temporal patience. The rules weren't a list of prohibitions. They were a behavioral map of a specific predatory methodology. The prohibition was the response to the behavior, not the behavior itself. And the behaviors formed a sequence. It approached with a story, the injured hiker, the broken call box. When that failed, it used acoustic communication, the whistling, the radio voice. When that failed, it used visual positioning, the figure on the ridgeline during the prohibited hours. It ran multiple vectors simultaneously when the sequential approach hadn't produced results. I added one more verb to my list, below the 7. Learns. Everything else on that list was a tactic. The last verb was the strategy. The tactics were the observable behavior. The strategy was what made the tactics progressively more effective across 30 years of seasonal postings. It was learning which tactics worked on which type of ranger. It was learning the protocols so it could work within them. And it was learning the personal information, the names, the histories, the specific grief that protocols couldn't account for, because protocols don't know what a given ranger is carrying when they arrive. It knew Webb's name. Webb hadn't said his name out loud. Webb's name had come from somewhere in the information landscape of a ranger's presence in a location, something Webb had transmitted, or thought, or carried, that the thing had found a way to read. I looked at my own name on the duty log cover. I thought about Connor's whistle on the kitchen table. I put the pen down and sat quietly for a moment. Then I went to check that all the locks were engaged, and I settled in to wait for night 8. I woke at 3 a.m. to the observation deck door standing open. Not ajar. Open. The latch fully disengaged, the door pushed inward by an inch or two, and held there by some slight pressure differential between the deck and the main room. The cold October air moving through the gap in a slow, deliberate way. I hadn't opened it. I was certain of that, with the particular certainty that comes from having checked every lock and latch in the building before lying down. I had checked the deck door twice once in my standard evening circuit. Once, specifically, because the prohibition hours were approaching, and I wanted to know the latch was secure. The latch was not secure. I lay still for a moment in the sleeping quarters, listening. The main room was quiet. The generator hummed. From outside, through the open door, came the sound of wind moving across the ridge, a low, sustained note. The sound of a high elevation forest at 3 a.m. Rule 12. If you find the deck door open during those hours, close it from the interior without stepping outside. Log it. move away from the exterior windows. I got up. I crossed the sleeping quarters to the doorway and looked into the main room. The observation deck door on the far wall was open a narrow gap, framing the darkness of the deck. And beyond the deck railing, the pale moonlit shape of the eastern ridgeline. I crossed the main room. I kept my eyes down, on the floor, on the door handle. I reached it. I grasped the handle from the inside with both hands, prepared to pull it closed. I allowed myself one look. The ridgeline was visible in the moonlight, the dark, serrated line of the hemlock canopy against the sky. And below it, at the point where the tree line broke at the edge of the bowl's upper perimeter, a figure, standing still, facing the outpost. The distance was 300 yards, and the moonlight was doing what moonlight does. Reducing detail, filling in silhouette, making shapes out of the space between shadows. I could not see a face. I could not see hands. What I could see was the overall form, the height and proportion, and the particular way the weight was distributed across the posture. My brother Connor had been 17 when he disappeared. He would have been 29 now. The figure on the ridgeline was the build of a young man. The posture was the posture of someone standing quietly, weight slightly forward. The way Connor stood when he was looking at something he found interesting. I pulled the door shut. The latch engaged. I stepped back from the door. I did not look at the south window. I did not look at the north window. I looked at the floor, at the pale rectangle of moonlight that was now cut off by the closed door. And I stood still and breathed deliberately until the tightness in my chest released enough to let me move. I knew what it was doing. That was the terrible part. I knew it had learned about Connor somehow, from somewhere in the information I'd brought to this posting. And it was using that knowledge in the precise and patient way it used everything it learned. The figure on the ridgeline was not Connor. It had never been Connor. Knowing that did not make the closed door easier to stand on this side of. 20 minutes after the deck door incident, a voice came from outside. Not the hoarse, frightened voice of the Night 7 knock. This was different. Quieter. The voice of someone who wasn't performing distress, but was simply speaking, at a volume calibrated for the specific distance between the tree line and the outpost wall. It said a name, not my name. Connor. Once. The way you'd call the name of someone you were looking for in a large space, not a shout, not a whisper, but the middle register of genuine searching, directed and quiet. I covered my mouth with my hand. The generator was running. The latch on the deck door was engaged. These were the two physical facts I held on to, while the silence after Connor's name settled into the room. Then the voice said it again. Connor. Softer this time, almost tender. The inflection of someone who has been calling for a long time and is losing the certainty that the person they're calling can hear them. I had heard my mother use exactly that inflection in the weeks after Connor disappeared, calling his name into phone receivers, into police station waiting rooms, into the specific middle-distance stare of someone who has stopped expecting an answer, but can't stop asking. I pressed my back against the interior wall and did not make a sound. Then the voice changed. Danny. My nickname. the name that exactly 4 people in the world call me: my mother, my father, my college roommate of 3 years, and a field supervisor I'd worked under early in my career, who had since retired to Florida. Not my colleagues, not my department contacts. Carla called me Mercer. Aldrin called me Mercer. Pruitt had called me Mercer. Danny. Danny, he's out here. He's been out here the whole time. Come see. I was sitting on the floor of the main room, with both hands pressed flat to the floorboards, and my jaw clenched so tightly that my teeth ached. I was 31 years old, and I had a graduate degree and 6 years of professional training. And I was sitting on the floor in the dark because something 300 yards away in the forest knew my brother's name and my nickname, and was using both of them in the specific sequence most likely to make me open the door. I did not open the door, but I want to be honest about how close it was. I want to be honest about the fact that there was a moment, brief, irrational, and completely real, when the rational knowledge that this was a lure deployed by a predatory entity, and the 12-year-old wound of not knowing what happened to Connor existed in my chest at exactly equal weight. And the choice to stay on the floor was not easy. It was the hardest thing I did in 6 weeks at Chimney Hollow. And the night wasn't finished. At 4:15, all 3 vectors activated simultaneously. The radio produced Aldrin's voice, a transmission, unprompted, telling me there was an access road issue and asking me to confirm my position. Rule 6. I did not respond. I moved to switch channels. Simultaneously, the exterior door erupted with knocking. Hard, rapid, multiple impacts in the pattern of genuine emergency, not the slow 3-knock of Night 7's performance, but the kind of knocking that hands make against a door when the person connected to those hands is afraid they're going to die in the next few minutes. A different voice this time. Not the previous hoarse voice, a woman's voice, high and frightened, saying, "Please, please, someone help, please." And simultaneously, the monitoring panel chimed. Station 4, Trigger 1, 40 seconds later, Trigger 2. I held all 3 in my hands at once. Radio channel 9, 3 keys, wait. Door rule 9, do not open. The call box is operational. Station 4, Rule 8, log it. Do not investigate. I moved through each response in sequence, mechanically, breathing through it. I keyed channel 9 3 times. I called through the door without touching the handle. I logged the station 4 triggers. The woman's voice outside screamed my name. My name, not Danny, Mercer, the professional name, the one on my duty log, the one on the door of the outpost's personnel sign. Trigger 3 from Station 4. 40 seconds after Trigger 2. Exactly. I was at the monitoring panel. I noted Trigger 3. I was standing at the east wall, the panel in front of me, the radio on the equipment table behind me, the exterior door to my left, the deck door across the main room to my right. I needed to check the south window to verify the call box status indicator was still showing green. I stepped left toward the south wall. I crossed to the exterior door, and I reached for the door handle, not to open it, to brace myself while I leaned toward the small side window at an angle that would show me the call box indicator panel mounted beside the door's exterior. Pure reflex. The motion was so practiced, so embedded in 6 days of doing it, that it bypassed conscious thought entirely. My hand found the door handle. My weight shifted. The door opened. I hadn't locked it. The cold air hit me, and I was through the threshold, one step onto the concrete exterior step, before my brain caught up with my body. I was outside. The cold hit my face. The gravel of the clearing was pale in the moonlight. The tree line was 300 yards away, and I could not see the ridgeline figure from this angle, but I knew it was there. From inside the outpost, from somewhere in the main room, between the equipment wall and the kitchen, clear and precise, and delivered at the exact rhythm I used every morning before stepping through that door. 2 short notes. My departure whistle, the safe signal. From inside the outpost, where I was no longer standing. I was outside. The entity was inside. It had the building. It had the radio. It had the keys on the hook beside the interior door. It knew the exit whistle meant the ranger was about to be outside, and it had whistled it from inside. And I was already outside, and the door was open between us. I did not reach for the door. I stepped back from the exterior door and let it swing on its hinges. It moved slowly in the slight pressure differential, not slamming, not latching, just hanging open 3 inches from the frame. The light from inside the outpost making a thin, vertical stripe across the step. I was in the clearing. No jacket. No radio. My flashlight was in my belt holster. I'd clipped it there from habit before lying down, and it was the only tool I had. The air was below freezing. My breath made short, pale plumes in the moonlight. The tree line was around me on 3 sides. The fire road was behind me to the south. 7 miles of gravel between this clearing and the district boundary. I had no means of transport. My truck keys were inside the outpost. I ran through my available options with the specific clarity that extreme situations sometimes produce, when the brain stops generating background noise and focuses entirely on the problem in front of it. I could not re-enter the outpost through the front door. The entity had whistled my departure signal from inside. It was positioned between me and the entry. And everything I knew about its behavioral pattern said that approach was what it was designed to elicit. It advanced when I retreated. It had positioned itself to make the outpost door the most dangerous point of re-entry available to me. I could not go down the fire road on foot. 7 miles in the dark, below freezing, no jacket, no way to call for help. And the entity's territorial range was unknown, but certainly included the tree-line corridor on both sides of that road. I stood in the clearing and I thought about Pruitt. Not her warning, not the logbooks. A specific sentence from our phone call, delivered almost as an aside, the kind of detail that surfaces in a conversation when someone is trying to cover every variable and isn't sure which ones will matter. It can't move toward you if you're moving toward it. It only advances when you retreat. She hadn't explained the mechanism. She hadn't had time, or she'd assumed I'd understand it, or she wasn't certain herself. But she'd said it with the weight of something she'd learned from experience rather than inference. The entity was a pursuit predator. Its behavioral pattern was built around a retreating target approach. When the target retreats, position when the target is stationary, wait when the target locks down. The rules were designed to keep the ranger stationary and locked down. The rules kept the ranger safe by keeping the ranger still. But the entity had learned the rules. It knew stationary wouldn't hold forever. I looked at the ridgeline, 300 yards of open hollow, pale and silver in the moonlight. At the tree line's edge, at the upper perimeter of the acoustic bowl, the figure was still there. Same position, still facing the outpost. I turned to face it directly, and I walked toward it. I walked at a steady pace. Not fast, not slow. The pace of a person crossing familiar ground with a specific destination. The outpost lights receded behind me. The clearing gravel gave way to the edge of the hollow's lower slope, where the terrain dropped slightly before rising toward the ridgeline. The moonlight was good enough to see ground irregularities, enough to navigate without the flashlight. I kept the flashlight off. I was aware, on some level I couldn't fully articulate, that the flashlight beam would have changed something about what I was doing. Pruitt had said it, and I was testing it with every step. It only advances when you retreat. The figure on the ridgeline did not move. I crossed the hollow's lower floor, mossy ground, damp underfoot, the same terrain as the acoustic bowl's interior. Sound behaved strangely here. My footsteps produced the familiar, delayed echo, the muted return from the encircling ridgelines. My breathing was audible to me. The wind through the hemlock canopy made a sound like distant conversation, not quite words. At 150 yards, the figure was still stationary. I understood, walking, what Pruitt had been telling me. The entity's methodology required a specific spatial dynamic. It was the pursuer, the approaching element, the thing that closed distance. Its strategies, the knock, the voice, the radio transmission, the figure on the ridgeline, were all designed to create a target that was contained, stationary, locked inside a defined perimeter. A ranger in the outpost, behind a locked door, following protocols that kept them in place. Remove the perimeter. Move toward it instead of away. The pursuit dynamic inverted. The entity had no strategy for a target that advanced. At 200 yards, nothing had changed. The figure was still at the tree line's edge, at the same position, facing the outpost that was now behind me rather than the ranger who was approaching. I kept walking. I kept thinking about the outpost behind me. What it was doing in there. Whether it had a behavior protocol for the ranger walking toward it that was separate from whatever it was doing in the building. Whether the building gambit and the ridgeline positioning were being run by separate aspects of the same entity, or whether the entity had effectively split its attention and diminished itself at both points. I didn't know. I had no data for that. I had Pruitt's one sentence and the evidence of my own feet carrying me forward without anything moving to stop me. 250 yards. The figure was still at the tree line. I walked the remaining 50 yards. I stopped at the edge of the acoustic bowl's upper perimeter. The figure was 8 feet away. In the moonlight, up close, with the hemlock canopy behind it, and the open hollow behind me, and nothing between us but cold air and 8 feet of moss-covered ground. I looked at it directly. The shape was correct. The proportions were correct. The height was correct, the height of a young man, 17 or 22, or any age between those two numbers, standing with his weight slightly forward, and one shoulder marginally lower than the other. The particular asymmetry of someone who favored their right arm. But the surface of it was wrong. I don't have better language than that. I've spent 11 months looking for better language, and I've consistently failed to find it. The surface of the figure was wrong in the way that a photograph of a person is wrong, technically accurate in terms of dimension and proportion, and the correct placement of every feature, but missing the indefinable quality that makes a human presence feel inhabited. It was the outline of a person without the substance of one. Correct in every measurable way, empty in every way that mattered. It did not move. I stood at the edge of the bowl and looked at it, and it stood 8 feet inside the tree line and looked at the outpost behind me. And for approximately 30 seconds, nothing happened. Then it made a sound. Not a whistle, not a voice, not any of the acoustic weapons I'd cataloged across 8 days of encounter. What it made was something underneath the threshold of those categories, a frequency that I heard less with my ears than with my chest, a resonance that the acoustic bowl caught and held and returned from every angle simultaneously. The bowl filled with it. The delayed echo carried it back from the ridgelines in overlapping waves, each return slightly altered in pitch, so that the sound multiplied and varied and grew until it occupied the hollow the way water occupies a cup, filling every available space. It lasted for 4 or 5 seconds. Then it stepped backward. 1 step, 2. The hemlock canopy swallowed it by degrees, first the lower half, then the shoulders, then the outline of the head. And then it was gone, and the tree line was just the tree line, dark and still and ordinary. The hollow was quiet, except for the wind. I stood at the bowl's edge for a long time. Then I turned around and walked back toward the outpost. The exterior door was still open. The light inside was still on. Whatever had been in there when I stepped outside had gone wherever the figure in the trees had gone. I went inside. I locked the door. I sat on the floor of the main room and waited for daylight. When the light was good enough, I checked the outpost room by room. Main room, kitchen, bathroom, sleeping quarters, storage room, equipment shed. Methodically, in the way you check a space when you need to know it's clear, and you need the checking to feel like enough. Everything appeared undisturbed. The equipment was in place. The food stores were untouched. The sleeping quarters were as I'd left them when I'd gotten up at 3. I went to the equipment wall. The bolts were there. 2 metal bolts. The washers still seated against the wall surface. The threads still showing where the nuts had been hand-tightened. The bolts were there. The laminated sheet was gone. Not torn, not fallen. Gone. The surface of the wall between the bolts was bare. I ran my hand across it. The paint was undisturbed. No impressions from the lamination's edge. No residue from the paper surface. Whatever had been between those bolts had been removed cleanly, with the kind of care that implied intention rather than accident. It had taken the rulebook. I stood in front of the empty wall for a long time. Then I looked at the space to the right of the bolts, the empty wall surface that ran to the edge of the equipment table. There was something on it, not written with anything I could readily identify. Dark, slightly glossy, the texture of something applied with a finger rather than an implement. 7 words in block letters. the handwriting of someone, something that had learned to produce letters the same way it had learned to produce voices, by observation, by repetition, by the particular patience of a thing that has all the time it needs. I know what you are looking for. 7 words. I looked at them for a long time. I photographed them twice. Then I went to the equipment shed, found the spare wall paint and a brush, came back, and painted over them. 2 coats. I painted the entire section of wall from the bolts to the table edge, overlapping the border by 6 inches on each side. When the second coat was dry enough to not transfer, I could not tell anything any had been written there. I sat down and wrote the most controlled duty log entry of my life. The extraction crew arrived at 0800. 2 rangers from District A, man named Flores, and a woman whose name I didn't catch, both of them wearing the professional competence of people executing a routine rotation handoff. They had a checklist. They worked through it efficiently, checking the equipment stores, the generator fuel level, the radio battery backup, the water filtration cartridge status. They asked if anything unusual had occurred during the posting. I looked at the wall behind Flores. The fresh paint was slightly brighter than the surrounding surface. You could see the edge of it if you knew to look. Flores was not looking. He was checking the equipment table inventory. Nothing that isn't in the duty log, I said. Section 7 of the duty log contained 4 entries: the whistling, the knock and the call box, the radio transmissions, the Station 4 triggers. The message on the wall was not in Section 7. The departure whistle from inside the outpost was not in Section 7. The 300 yards I'd walked toward the tree line in the dark was not in Section 7. The figure at the edge of the bowl and the sound it made that wasn't sound, and the way it had stepped backward into the hemlock and disappeared were not in Section 7. I told myself I omitted those details because they were not documentable in the clinical language that Section 7 required. I told myself a duty log was not the appropriate vehicle for a full account. These were not entirely untrue reasons. But the true reason was simpler. I had painted over the message on the wall, and I had omitted the corresponding events from the log because some part of me, the part that had been sitting on floors and pressing backs against walls and listening to departure whistles from inside empty rooms, understood that the full account of what happened at Chimney Hollow would not be believed and would not be acted upon and would not protect the next ranger. I got into the extraction truck with my pack and my personal journal and the satellite phone. I did not look back at the outpost when we pulled out of the clearing. I should have looked back. I know that now. I should have turned and looked at the outpost and at the tree line beyond it, and at the specific point on the ridge line where the acoustic bowl's upper perimeter meets the hemlock stand. I should have looked and noted the position of anything that was standing there in the daylight, watching the truck drive away. I didn't look. And I've wondered, in the 11 months since, whether what I didn't see was still there or had gone somewhere else. The interdepartment memo arrived in my inbox on a Tuesday morning, 11 months after extraction. Standard rotation notification. Chimney Hollow Outpost. Autumn seasonal posting. 6 weeks. The assigned ranger's name was listed in the standard format: last name, first initial, employee number. A name I didn't recognize. I almost closed the memo. Then I opened the department personnel directory and ran the name. The assigned ranger's emergency contact was listed, as required for solo remote postings. Name, relationship, phone number. The emergency contact's surname was different from the ranger's. A married name, probably, or the other parent's family name. I noted it without thinking. I was about to close the directory when something in the emergency contact's surname caught at a corner of my memory that I couldn't immediately place. I opened a different window. The database of public missing persons reports for Western North Carolina, which I had looked at more times than I could count in the years since Connor disappeared. I had the relevant case files memorized in the specific, involuntary way of things you've reviewed too many times to stop knowing. The emergency contact's surname matched the surname of a family listed in a missing persons report from a North Carolina camping trip, September 2003. I sat at my desk for a long time. I thought about Pruitt's phrase, 30 years of seasonal rotations. I thought about Webb's logbook. I don't know how it knows my name. I thought about what Pruitt had said about the learning problem that it chose, that it watched, that it incorporated what it learned. I thought about the child's whistle on my kitchen table and the figure on the ridgeline with Connor's posture and the message painted in the dark on the outpost wall. I know what you are looking for. I had been looking for Connor for 12 years, unconsciously, deliberately, in the specific way that grief arranges itself into career choices and posting applications, and the selection of a 6-week solo rotation in the mountains of eastern Tennessee. The new ranger was leaving for Chimney Hollow in 9 days. I opened a new document, and I began to write. If you're the ranger assigned to Chimney Hollow this autumn, I need you to listen to me. Read the rulebook before dark. Don't read it the way I read it the first time, skeptically, looking for the rational framework, deciding in the back of your mind that it's hazing or folklore or some kind of institutional overcaution. Read it the way the people who wrote it intended it to be read, which is as a precise operational document produced by individuals who needed it to exist. Every rule is there because someone's direct experience made it necessary. That experience was real. The rule is the only record of it that will be officially accessible to you. Don't whistle. I can't explain to you what will whistle back because I don't have language that does justice. What I can tell you is that the returned sound will be exact, your pitch, your rhythm, your melody, and that exactness is the most frightening thing you will ever hear, because it means something close enough to hear. You clearly has been patient enough to wait for you to forget. Don't bring anything inside that you found on the trail. I know how that sounds. Follow the rule anyway. Don't open the door after 2100 if someone knocks. I know what that costs. I know what it feels like to sit with your back against the wall while a voice outside says things calculated to make you get up. The call box is not broken. It is never broken. Whatever is outside knows that you know that, and it will say it anyway, because it has said it before, and it is patient. and it is learning which rangers it can move and which rangers it cannot. Don't go near the observation deck between 0200 and 0430. If the deck door is open, close it from the inside. Don't look out first. Close it. If you look first, you'll see something on the ridgeline that knows what you're looking for. And knowing that it knows will be worse than anything else that happens to you there. Don't respond to radio transmissions you can't verify. You know the voices of your supervisors. What you'll hear on the radio will also know those voices. It will have them more precisely than you might expect. Switch to channel 9. Key 3 times. Wait 4 minutes. Trust the count. And when you leave the outpost, every time you leave, produce 2 short whistle tones before you step through the door. If those tones come from inside the building before you've made them, do not step outside. Secure the door. Begin emergency protocol. Do not wait. Do not second-guess what you heard. If you are already outside when you hear the tones from inside, do not go back through the door. Walk toward the tree line. I know how that sounds. Walk toward it. It retreats from a target that advances. I have tested this. It works. Walk at a steady pace in the direction of the acoustic bowl at Station 4 until whatever is on the ridgeline moves back into the hemlock canopy. Then return to the outpost through the rear equipment shed door, which it does not appear to use. I don't know why it doesn't use the shed door. I don't know the limits of what it can do, or how far its territory extends, or why it chooses the rangers it chooses. I have theories. I have 11 months of sleepless theories. What I know for certain is this: the rules work if you follow them exactly. And it has been learning the rules for longer than either of us has been alive. And it is getting better. I never found out what it does with the ones who break the last rule. I hope you never find out either. But it's learning. It is always learning. And the fact that I'm still here means it isn't done with me yet. Watch the ridgeline. Don't whistle. And whatever it says from the dark outside your door, whatever name it uses, whatever voice it borrows, whatever it tells you is waiting for you in the trees. Don't run. Never run.